Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about the current system, how it works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune S-O-C. Today's show is entitled In Solitary Confinement in New York City, Jails and New York State Prisons. Over the past several years, jails and prison advocates and activists has called for the ending of solitary confinement, a practice that has subjected generations of incarcerated men and women to inhumane punishment and segregated confinement with little to no human interaction for extended periods of time. As a result, many have experienced emotional and physical trauma, while others, like Khalif Browder, Layleen Polanco, and countless others, lost their lives. According to a report from the Prison Policy Initiative, in the United States, where the use of solitary confinement is widespread, an estimated 80,000 people are held in some form of isolation, and on any given day, and in a single year, over 10,000 people were released to the community directly from solitary. And premature deaths by suicide, by homicide, or opioid overdose at the release from prison are more likely for those that spent any amount of time, even one day, in solitary confinement than those who have never experienced solitary confinement. On March 9, 2021, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced plans to eliminate the use of solitary confinement in the city's jail system. The mayor worked with the Board of Corrections, who proposed a plan that replaced solitary confinement. That plan will consist of a 3-level progression model known as the Risk Management Accountability System, which aims to ensure that people will be provided with the support they need to successfully reenter general population and eventually their communities. Following the mayor's announcement, on April 1st, 2021, Governor Andrew M. Cuomo signed the HALT Solitary Confinement Act into law. And this law, obviously, was reforming the practice of segregated confinement in New York State correction facilities. The legislation limits the amount of time an incarcerated person can spend in segregated confinement to 15 days, clearly defines and reduces the number of disciplinary infractions eligible for segregated confinement, and exempts certain vulnerable populations from going into solitary. And those populations include the young, elderly, pregnant women, people with disabilities, and individuals with serious mental illness. In this episode of Both Sides of the Bars, we are joined by the Fortune Society's Executive Vice President and Board of Corrections member, Stanley Richards, and HALT Solitary Confinement statewide organizer, Jerome Wright, to talk about the ending of solitary confinement in New York City jails and the passing of the HALT Solitary Confinement Act that applies to New York State prisons. Stanley Richards, Jerome Wright, welcome to Both Sides of the Bars. How are each of you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you, Andre. Glad to be here.
Jerome, how are you feeling today?
Yes, thanks for the opportunity, my brother. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And we're really excited to have each of you on both sides of the bars. You know, there has been a lot of movement that's happened in the criminal legal reform world as it relates to advocacy. And we know that one of the premier victories that we have experienced in this movement is around the passing of HALT solitary confinement. Yet there's also some things that have been happening on the city level that is addressing solitary confinement. And I'll start with you, Stanley. I know that you are doing some work with the Board of Corrections and others, right, to work on ending solitary confinement and offering a real plan for that. So give us our viewers just a little history on how we've gotten to where we are today, solitary confinement.
Well, we've gotten to this moment nationally and locally because of the voices and the power of the grassroots movement and advocacy. Community members, advocates came out and said it is time for us to fundamentally address the injustices that for far too long this country has had a blind eye towards, and that is mass incarceration. We've seen number of people being arrested and incarcerated go up over the decades. And we're now at a point where people are saying, we need to put an end to it. Mass incarceration doesn't make our community safer. It doesn't provide the kind of reentry supports for people need to rebuild their lives after incarceration. And what goes on behind the walls should no longer be secret and be in isolation. That we need to put eyes in our institutions to hold institutions accountable for the kind of trauma and brutality that goes on. And so for years, advocates have been calling for the fundamental change. In New York City, it happened with the closed Rikers movement. It happened as a result of the speaker putting together the Lippman Commission to look at fundamentally changing New York City's criminal justice system, and the Lippman report coming out calling for and supporting what advocates have been calling for, the closure of Rikers Island. And as a result of that, we've seen two horrific events that happened to two of our community members, Khalif Browder and Laleen Polanco, where their deaths were a result of the isolation and trauma that goes on behind the walls and in our jails and in our prisons. And that rally called for the ending of solitary confinement. And you had advocates calling for the HALT bill, which the governor signed. We're really pleased with that. And it called for the New York City mayor to put together a working group to end solitary confinement, something that the Board of Correction has been taking up over the last 5 years, looking at ways to fundamentally reform and bring to light and accountability how people are managed in our jails. And so we're at a point right now where the Board of Corrections has started public hearings on the initial draft rules that we put forth, called RMAS, Risk Management Accountability System, that we hope brings transparency to a system that for far too long has been isolated, that brings accountability for those who significantly harm somebody without providing additional trauma and isolation. And it builds in a way for people to build back into general population after being removed for committing a significant offense. And so what we put forth is a 3-level model. It is a framework. It is not the end. And we had over 65 people join our meeting today to hear public comment on the rules. We had over 45 speakers who spoke out passionately about what we need to do to improve what we have presented. And we're looking forward to this continued conversation. We have another public meeting tomorrow, April 14th. And we are looking forward to making the bill even better, making the rule even better than what we proposed. And so it's a beginning point. It's not an end point, but it is an end point to what we all know is very traumatic and very punitive, and doesn't make our jails and prisons safer, and does massive harm to those when they're released into the community.
Absolutely, Stanley. And again, you've been entrenched in this work on the city level, and obviously that has like state implications by virtue of HALT Solitary Confinement. And so now I want to turn to Jerome. Like Jerome, you've been completely immersed, right, in state level work around ending the practice of solitary confinement in New York State. It has now been passed as law by the governor. But give our viewers just some context and history too around the state impact, right, of solitary confinement, what it does to people while they're incarcerated, et cetera. Jerome?
Sure. Thank you. Well, first of all, let me just say, as a survivor of solitary myself, and I use the term survivor loosely because there are some residual damage that I still have to deal with. I can tell you it is torture. It is, people think we throw around the word torture like, just unjudiciously, but I can tell you as somebody who's experienced, have the lived experience, that I don't think nothing can bring you closer to the edge of your sanity than to be left alone to your own devices when at that point your own mind is not even working right. So rather than getting help and treatment to help you to get your mind to work right to begin with, you get put in this extreme isolation, and then the desensitization, the lack of any real human contact, the lack of education, the lack of therapy, programming, the lack of even interaction with religious services, all stem to make you feel less than human. It is much dehumanizing, and the torture is real. As a matter of fact of the matter is this all stems from the UN General Assembly's rule on the treatment of people who are incarcerated, that the rule says that anything more than 15 consecutive days of isolation is considered torture. And routinely in the city and in the state, we have had men, women, and children in this isolated confinement, solitary, for weeks, months, years, and decades.
And when you say UN, Jerome, you mean the United Nations?
The United Nations, right?
Okay.
So this is international law.
Right.
So you putting people in prison for allegedly breaking state and city laws when you are visiting on them a violation of international proportions by violating the international law, which is affectionately known as the Mandela Rules. That's what they're called. They're codified as the Mandela Rules, and said no one should be. Listen, right now, a person could go and bomb in complete barracks of American soldiers and would be put in a detention situation and could not be held for more than 15 consecutive days by international law. But in New York City and in New York State, we take John Q. Citizen, some cases who have not even been convicted of a crime, and put them in a situation of isolation and torture. That's what HALT did. And HALT, as a state bill, is state and city. So it will have implications on city. But the thing about the city bill, the city movement rather, is that it is for the abolition of solitary in its entirety. We're talking about reforming solitary with HALT. And I don't think we went far enough, but anything to ameliorate the suffering and torture that I went through, I would agree to. Now, I think that the city bill goes further. It is a more comprehensive attempt to end the whole saga of this torture. But yeah, we need to end it. We need to end it.
Absolutely. And Stanley, going back to Jerome's statement around on the city level, seeking to end it, like what does that mean, Stanley, right? Looking just to end it, to abolish it altogether in New York City jails.
Yeah, so it means a couple of things. One, as you know, solitary confinement was where you was locked in 23 hours a day. The state changed it where you had to have 4 hours out minimum. So you're locked in still 20 hours a day in your cell, right? You're in a individual cell and you are locked in there 20 hours out of the day. And what we have done is to say, under normal circumstances in general pop, people are allowed 14 hours out of cell. And what we've created is a model that, as I said, holds people accountable. So in level 1, people are able to come out of the cell and participate in what's called the ante room, or a cell, an additional day room, a separate individual day room. Well, they're able to be in that for 10 hours a day. They can come out of their cell for 10 hours a day in level 1. When they go to level 2, they are in a small group setting, individual cells still, but their day room is small group, 4 to 5 people in that particular area. And they are able to come out 12 hours a day. And in level 3, it's just like general pop. They're able to come out and mingle with the entire house, and they're out 14 hours a day. And it's sort of an incentive model where people go from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, which level 3 really is general pop. And each one of those levels, there is intensive programming that's part of it, which is also part of what HALT does. And there are time limits. Advocates are calling for us to put definitive time limits, but there are time limits on how long someone could stay in level 1, how long someone could stay in level 2 and level 3. We've been hearing feedback that we need to tighten down on the timeline, the time people can spend in there, but there's a specific amount of time that people can spend in there, and they get evaluated and can move to the next level during those evaluation periods.
Got it. And so, Jerome, going back to HALT Solitary Confinement, describe to our viewers, right, what are some of the elements in it, right? What are some of the provisions, right? I know not having someone inside for up to 15 days. What are some of the other elements and provisions that make up this bill? You're on mute, Jerome.
Yes, technology. So it is really a comprehensive approach. It's not just the 15 days. We're talking about the due process allocations that come before you even get there. Right now, if you went to any solitary confinement unit, right now, about 45 to 50% of people there shouldn't be there because the offense that they're charged with should not have risen to the level of them being put in this. So we're talking about only certain categories of people who violate certain rules would even be eligible to go to solitary confinement. The other thing is we have exclusionary classes, and you mentioned some of them. No pregnant or nursing mother will ever see the inside of a solitary confinement cell, and they shouldn't. Nobody under 21 who we all know that. Listen, I was under 21 a while ago. I ain't had no sense then. I don't know why people think that just because you 16, 17, 18 that you got it together because you think you got it together. And so now we won't do that. We'll get people under 21 help. They don't have to go to solitary and lose their minds or end up like Khalif Browder. We have other exclusionary classes like if you have a diagnosed mental health issue, you should not be in solitary can only exacerbate that issue and usually leads to more trauma, suicides where most happen in solitary. So it will stop people who have mental health issues from getting what they don't need, torture, what they do need, treatment. And the whole principle behind HALT is that there will be accountability and monitoring. This system has gone off the rails for so long. Getting it back on the rails is not a signing by the governor. It's going to need to be monitored, reporting. Right now, almost 60% of the people in solitary confinement are Black and brown people. Why is that? That is a racially motivated system of punishment. We need to eviscerate that racial demographic. And the only way we can do that is with reporting, monitoring, and holding people accountable. And that's what HALT would also do.
And so, Stanley, you talked about like monitoring, right? You're part of the working group. I know one of the leads there. So talk a little bit about what that monitoring looks like, if you're able to, and some of the other elements of the work of the Board of Corrections in terms of solitary confinement.
Yeah, our work is to monitor the rules that we establish. And so we've built in there robust reporting that also includes public reporting on how RMS is being rolled out, how it's being utilized. There are similar exclusions like the HALT bill around serious mental illness and other exclusions. We've heard more feedback today that we need to broaden the exclusions that we have on there. So we have significant reporting, and part of our role is to be able to keep eyes on an institution that has far too long been isolated from public view. So in addition to the public reporting, we have staff who will be going out there, who will be keeping eyes on it. We have access to some of the Gen-Tech cameras so we can take a look at what's going on out there. And at Fortune, we have been advocating for a body camera bill so that the same kind of eyes we have on the streets right now that's capturing the brutality that's happening on the streets with police interaction with community members, we want that same level of oversight in our jails and in our prisons. So the Board of Corrections is taking a step. Fortune as an advocacy organization is proposing some additional ways that we can keep eyes on our institutions and take them from the darks of the corner into the lights and accountability of the community. And we're looking forward to continuing to build out this rule to ensure that we have something that is fair, equitable, and accountable. One other thing I'd like to say, in RMAS, level 1 is only for someone who has committed an infraction where someone was significantly injured, meaning that they drew blood. RMAS level 1 is not for someone who gets into a fight. It is not for someone who has a out of place infraction. It is not for someone who might talk back to an officer and get into a verbal confrontation with an officer. Level 1 is only for someone who has committed an infraction that resulted in the harm of another individual, meaning that they drew blood and there was significant harm.
Thank you, Stanley. And so back to you, Jerome, in terms of monitoring, and what's in place with the HALT Solitary Confinement Act bill? Is there a monitoring mechanism to ensure that those things are going to be enforced? Talk to our viewers about that.
Yes, there is monitoring, and on the level of what Stanley just talked about. First of all, there's reporting. In order to monitor some things, they have to report out on what we are asking. So there are a set of metrics that come along with the HALT bill that would require them to monitor who's going in, with stuff that they do not provide right now. Who's going in on a daily basis, what their demographic is, what their age is, what status they are, security, what level of violation, and even monitoring to some level the officers who we know there are some bad apples who are the repeat offenders. They talk about recidivists by incarcerated people. You got recidivating officers who roll around causing problems and try to justify their very existence by enforcing rules and causing problems. So there's that. The other thing is, outside of the monitoring, there's monitoring by agencies, an outside agency. We know that most of these agencies are incapable of policing themselves. So we would deal with organizations that we have not assigned yet, but on the level of a correctional association or an independent group who would have immediate ability to go in and talk to people, to review stuff, to subpoena, the whole works. So this will be something where you have monitoring, reporting, accountability, and there has to be some teeth in it, because now that it's law, there are consequences.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Stanley, so, in terms of some of the work that lies ahead now, right? I know that there have been a series of hearings. What will follow from those series of hearings?
Well, the process, we're in CAPA right now, and that is the way that bodies like the Board of Correction can establish rules to guide the work that goes on in the department. So we have 2 public hearings. We're accepting written comments through Friday, April 16th. And we will reconvene, review the comments that we received, make modifications that we see and deem necessary. Once we make those modifications, we need to review with the law department those rules and then take a final vote on those rules. And when we take a final vote, those rules would then become law that DLC would need to abide by. So that's one part of the process. There's another part of the process that we need to tackle, and that is the front end of our criminal justice system. And it's not necessarily the board's role, but it is something that Fortune and other organizations, and something Jerome just talked about. We must reduce reliance on mass incarceration. It starts with police reform, and there's a blueprint for police reform, and there's a commission that's looking at race and equity in this city. And you can't begin to look at race and equity in this city unless you look at the charter, the guiding document that establishes every agency and every government function in our city. And until we can look at the race and equity issue through the lens of our charter and change our charter to ensure that Black and brown people are involved and supported and treated fairly in the way that the city does its business, we need to, that's how we're going to get at ending mass incarceration, because you can't talk about ending mass incarceration if you don't talk about racism, if you don't talk about poverty, if you don't talk about homelessness, if you don't talk about educational inequity, if you don't talk about economic stability. If you don't talk about those things, you can't talk about ending mass incarceration. And we are all doing really good work, Jerome, other organizations, Fortune, around trying to stem the tide of the damage that we know have been going on for far too long. But the time now is to do that work, but to ramp it up by looking at the foundational issues that drive mass incarceration. And so as an organization that's been around for 54 years, we have been taking on economic inequality. We've been taking on housing inequality. We have been taking on a number of issues that really drive mass incarceration. And we have to do that in a bold and progressive way right now. The time is now. We
Absolutely.
can't afford to lose another soul to this devastating system.
Absolutely. And Jerome, I'm going to leave you with some final closing thoughts as we wrap up, unfortunately, gentlemen. But some closing thoughts, too, following Stanley.
I don't, you know what? I was thinking, how do you follow that? And he did give me the perfect segue. As he talked about on the city level, the charter, we need to be talking about on the state and the federal level, the Constitution, the founding document that prescribed racism while it pretended to be a document for the people, by the people, and of the people. At the time that that document was signed and sealed and delivered, the founding fathers had slaves. And what we have now in mass incarceration is this new Jim Crow reenactment of slavery. And in order for us to end that, we need to take out this 13th Amendment exception that if you're duly convicted of a crime, then you can be considered a slave. Because as long as we consider any individual human being a slave, we will have mass incarceration, and we will allow things like solitary and all of the other ills that go along with that system to be visited upon those who are oppressed. And right now they're talking Black, brown, Latinx people. So the time is now. If we're going to really, I guess the best term I could say, blow this thing up, then we need to look at these foundational doctrines and principles and documents, and we need to change them to fundamentally change the way we look at each other and deal with each other, especially as it goes to criminal justice reform.
Absolutely. We have about 30 seconds left, and we will have a segment on addressing the 13th Amendment. There are some folk in New Jersey that are working on amending the 13th Amendment, and so we'll have them on too. But in like 5 seconds or so, Stanley, can you let people know how they can get in contact with you? Same thing with you, Jerome.
You can get in contact with me at www.fortunesociety.org, srichards@fortunesociety.org, or srichards@boc.nyc.gov. And I am feeling hopeful of the moment.
Yep.
A lot of work, but hopeful.
Jerome?
Yeah, I would say jwright@newyorkcake.org. And I don't have all those other hashtags because I'm not out there on the platforms like that yet, but I am involved with Twitter and Facebook and everything through our New York Cake account. You can always get in touch with me there, and I look forward to hearing from you. We need more people involved. The brothers here, I mean, I like to see a panel of strong melanated brothers here representing and getting you the information, but we need those same strong melanated brothers to walk side by side as we try to uproot the racism that kept us where we at this far.
Absolutely. Jerome Wright, Stanley Richards, thanks so much for joining Both Sides of the Bars. And we thank you, viewers, for joining Both Sides of the Bars. We look forward to hearing from you soon. And please continue to watch Both Sides of the Bars.